Imagine standing on a wooden scaffold in the middle of a desolate, snow-covered square in St. Petersburg. The year is 1849. The air is so cold it burns your lungs. You are tied to a post, wearing nothing but a thin white shroud, your funeral garment. To your left and right are your friends, men you've shared tea and revolutionary dreams with. Now you share a death sentence. You hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of soldiers' boots. You hear the terrifyingly mechanical sound of rifles being raised and the kick-kick of hammers being cocked. You are 28 years old, a rising star in the literary world, and in exactly 10 seconds, your consciousness will cease to exist. You close your eyes, bracing for the impact of lead. But the roar of the guns never comes. Instead, there is the frantic gallop of a horse and the voice of an officer shouting a pardon from the Tsar. The execution was a sham, a meticulously planned psychological torture designed by the state to crush your will. One of the men tied next to you loses his sanity on the spot. He is led away, screaming, his mind broken forever. But you walk away with something else. You walk away with a mind that has touched the absolute edge of existence. You have looked into the abyss, and for the rest of your life, the abyss will look back through you. This is Fyodor Dostoyevsky. He is not just a novelist, he is a psychological surgeon. He is the man who looked into the darkest, most stagnant corners of the human heart, the places we hide from our neighbors and even from ourselves. And he brought back a map of the underground. While the Western world was falling in love with reason, science, and the idea of progress, Dostoyevsky was sounding the alarm. He knew that the human soul is irrational, chaotic, and dangerously free. Today, on Deconstructing Minds, we perform a psychological autopsy on the novelist of the soul. We are moving past the academic lectures to find the man who was a gambling addict, a political convict, a mystic epileptic, and a prophet. How did a faked execution and 4 years in a Siberian hellscape create the greatest psychological explorer in human history? Let us deconstruct the mind that Friedrich Nietzsche called the only one who taught me anything about psychology. To understand the agonizing guilt that haunts every page Dostoevsky ever wrote, we must travel back to the grim corridors of the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor in Moscow. This was Fyodor's childhood home. His father, Mikhail, was a military surgeon, a man of rigid discipline, a harsh temper, and a growing dependency on alcohol. Imagine a young, sensitive boy growing up in the shadow of a hospital for the destitute. While other children played, Fyodor watched the broken, the dying, and the desperate. His father was a tyrant at home, demanding absolute silence and perfect obedience. Mikhail was a man of order, but inside him was a swirling storm of insecurity and rage. The psychological fracture occurred in 1839. Fyodor was 17, studying in St. Petersburg, when news arrived from the family's small country estate. His father was dead. The official report said it was a stroke, but the local rumors whispered something far more terrifying. Mikhail had been murdered by his own serfs. They claimed that during one of his drunken rages, the peasants had ambushed him on a lonely road, held him down, and suffocated him with a cushion. For young Fyodor, this wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a narcissistic trauma of the highest order. He had hated his father. He had wished for his father's death in the deepest, darkest parts of his mind. And now the universe had granted his wish. In the eyes of a child, wishing for a crime is the same as committing it. This is the birth of the parricide complex that would later define his masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov. Dostoevsky spent the rest of his life asking, if I desired the murder, am I as guilty as the man who held the cushion? It is no coincidence that his legendary epileptic fits reportedly became more frequent and intense after his father's death. His body was somatizing a trauma that his mind could not process. The shaking, the foaming at the mouth, the loss of consciousness, It was a physical manifestation of a soul trying to escape the crushing weight of unearned guilt. He learned early that the line between a saint and a monster is not a wall, but a thin, vibrating wire. He didn't just write about crime. He felt the crime pulsing in his own veins. In the winter of 1850, the rational socialist died, and the prophet of the abyss was born. Fyodor Dostoyevsky arrived at the Omsk fortress in Siberia not as a famous author, but as convict number 267. His head was half-shaved, his clothes were rags, and 10-pound iron shackles were riveted to his ankles. He would not take those shackles off for a single second for the next 4 years. Not even to sleep, not even to bathe. Imagine the psychological state of an aristocrat, an intellectual who lived for ideas and books, being thrown into a crowded wooden barrack with 200 of Russia's most violent criminals, murderers, child abusers, and brigands. The air was a thick, stinking soup of sweat, excrement, and tobacco smoke. The noise was a never-ending roar of curses and clanking chains. This was a total sensory and social trauma. For the first year, Dostoyevsky lived in a state of acute psychological shock. He was hated by the other prisoners, not because he was a criminal, but because he was a gentleman. The peasants in the barracks saw him as a symbol of the class that had oppressed them for centuries. They spat in his food and threatened his life. He was a stranger in the most literal, terrifying sense. But it was here, in the filth of the Omsk fortress, that Dostoyevsky experienced a radical shift in identity. Most men would have been crushed by the resentment, but Dostoyevsky, driven by his innate psychological curiosity, began to perform a silent field study of the human soul in its most naked form. He realized that these monsters were not different from him. He began to see that the line between the pure intellectual and the bloody killer was a terrifyingly thin membrane. He saw the divine spark in a man who had slaughtered a whole family, and he saw the potential for murder in himself. His Siberian years were not just a punishment, they were a psychological dismantling. The Tsar had broken his body, but in doing so, he had accidentally opened the doors to Dostoyevsky's underground. While in prison, Dostoyevsky was allowed only one book, the New Testament. He read it until the pages turned to dust. But he wasn't just learning religion, he was observing a living psychological experiment. In his book, Notes from a Dead House, he would later record the most profound discovery of his life, one that would shatter the progressive ideas of the West. He noticed something bizarre about the prisoners. Even when they were given a chance to have a bit of comfort, they would often do something self-destructive. They would smuggle in alcohol, get violently drunk, and get beaten by the guards. Or they would gamble away their last few kopecks in a single minute. Why? Rational philosophers in Europe claim that humans always act in their self-interest. But Dostoyevsky saw the truth. The human soul values freedom more than well-being, even if that freedom means the freedom to suffer. He realized that a human being is not a piano key that plays when it's struck by logic. A human is a creature that will consciously choose madness, pain, or chaos just to prove that they are not a machine. This is the birth of his philosophy of the irrational. Prison taught him that you cannot fix society by changing the laws or the economy. If you build a perfect palace for humanity where every need is met, someone will eventually want to burn it down just to see if they still have the will to do so. This insight is what makes him the father of existential psychology. He saw that we are condemned to be free, and that our greatest burden is not the chains on our legs, but the terrifying darkness inside our own hearts. He didn't just study criminals, he realized that we are all responsible for everyone and everything, a realization of universal guilt that would become the backbone of his future masterpieces. Dostoyevsky did not just have epilepsy, he lived in a constant cycle of death and resurrection. He called it his sacred disease, a term that highlights the terrifyingly thin line between a neurological malfunction and a mystical revelation. To understand his psyche, we must understand the aura, that brief, blinding second before a seizure hits. Imagine a state of consciousness where time suddenly stops. Every sensation becomes hyper-real. You feel a sense of eternal harmony, so profound that you would give 10 years of your life, or even life itself, for just 5 seconds of this feeling. It is a moment of total clarity, a feeling of being in direct contact with the divine. Dostoevsky described it through his character Prince Mishkin. A sense of being, of self-awareness, was multiplied tenfold. All anxiety, all doubts, all unrest were as if smoothed away. They were resolved in a kind of higher calm. But this paradise comes with a devastating psychological tax. Immediately following this peak of ecstasy comes the abyssal fall. The seizure itself is a violent, humiliating loss of control, convulsions, foaming at the mouth, the total erasure of the self. And when he woke up, he was plunged into a post-ictal depression, so dark it felt like a funeral of the soul. He would wander through his room for days, unable to remember his own name, feeling a nameless guilt, as if he had committed a terrible crime in his sleep. Psychologically, his epilepsy was the somatization of extremes. His brain was wired to experience the highest highs and the lowest lows. This is why his characters are never stable. They are always either in a state of religious fever or suicidal despair. His sacred disease taught him that human truth isn't found in the middle ground of normalcy, but at the edges of consciousness. He realized that the human mind is a gateway between heaven and hell, and that one cannot experience the light without paying for it with the darkness of the pit. If epilepsy was a storm that came from within, gambling was a fire that Dostoevsky lit himself. For years while living in Europe, he was possessed by a devastating addiction to the roulette wheel. He would lose his last ruble, pawn his wife's wedding ring, and even her winter coat, leaving them starving and freezing in foreign hotel rooms. To a casual observer, he was a ludomaniac, a man out of control. Но с точки зрения деконструкции его разума, игромания была psychological compulsion to repeat the firing squad. Think back to those 22 minutes at the stake. That moment of absolute uncertainty. Will I live or will I die? The roulette wheel offered him a way to recreate that thrill. Every time the ball spun, he was back at the execution post. The moment of the gamble was the only time he felt truly alive, because it was the only time he felt the same terrifying intensity of being he had felt when the rifles were pointed at him. But there was a darker layer. The need for self-punishment. Dostoevsky often felt a crushing guilt for his father's death and for simply being alive when others had died in Siberia. By losing everything at the casino, he was performing a ritual of self-destruction. He needed to lose. He needed to be humiliated. He would beg for money from friends, crawling in his letters, demeaning himself, all to feed a cycle of sin and repentance. His gambling wasn't about the money, it was about the thrill of the void. It taught him the mechanics of temptation and the psychology of the will. He realized that a man can know exactly what is good for him and still choose the very thing that will destroy him, just to feel the rush of his own freedom. This insight became the foundation of his novel The Gambler, where he stripped away the romantic myths of addiction and showed it for what it truly was, a war between a man and his own self-destructive soul. Dostoevsky did not write characters. he created autonomous psychological entities. The literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin coined the term polyphony to describe this unique phenomenon. In most novels, the author is God. Every character is a puppet reflecting the author's voice. But in the mind of Dostoyevsky, every character is a fully realized, independent voice that often argues with the author himself. Psychologically, this reflects Dostoyevsky's own fragmented personality. He was not one man. He was a battlefield where a saint, a murderer, a gambler, and a nihilist fought for dominance. When he wrote The Brothers Karamazov, he didn't just invent Alyosha or Ivan, he split his own soul into pieces. Dostoyevsky understood the multiplicity of the self long before Freud or Jung. He realized that the human mind is not a single rational unit, but a parliament of voices, many of which are dark, irrational, and hidden in the shadows. He explored the subconscious decades before it had a name. He showed us that a man can commit a brutal murder out of an abstract theory, like Raskolnikov, and yet be haunted by a conscience he didn't even know he possessed. He was the first to deconstruct the intellectual narcissism of the modern age. He warned that when we try to solve the human problem through pure logic or social engineering, we ignore the underground man who lives in all of us, the one who will destroy everything just to prove he cannot be calculated. His polyphonic mind allowed him to give a fair hearing to the most terrible ideas, only to show that without the salt of the soul, even the most brilliant intellect leads to the abyss. He didn't just describe psychology, he performed it, inviting the reader to sit in the witness stand as his characters put humanity on trial. Fyodor Dostoyevsky died in 1881, but his shadow has only grown longer with time. When his funeral procession moved through the streets of St. Petersburg, it was attended by tens of thousands. Convicts walked alongside aristocrats, united by the man who had understood both of them. On Deconstructing Minds, our autopsy of Dostoyevsky reveals a terrifying yet hopeful truth. The crack in the soul is where the light gets in. Dostoyevsky was a wounded healer. Every one of his insights was paid for in blood, seizures, and the cold iron of Siberian chains. We deconstruct him not to judge his gambling or his guilt, but to see how a broken man can become a mirror for all of humanity. He showed us that guilt is not a burden, but a gateway to empathy. Suffering is not a mistake, but a teacher of freedom. The abyss is not just a place of darkness, but the only place where we can truly find our own light. He was the man who looked into the mouth of hell and found the face of God. He warned us that the greatest danger to humanity is not our evil, but our rationality if it loses its connection to the heart. Dostoyevsky remains the ultimate challenge to the modern world. He tells us that we are all responsible for all, and that the only way to save the world is to first descend into the underground of our own souls. He didn't just write books, he left us a warning. In a world of machines and algorithms, he reminds us that we are still creatures that can get used to anything, but also creatures that can find redemption in the very middle of the fire.